Om Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudramarudastunnyanti Divyaistavaihi Vedai Sangapatakramopanisadaihi Gayanti Yam Samagaha Dhyanavasthita Tadgatena Manasa Pasyanti Yam Yogino Yasyandam Navidussurasura Devaya Tasmai Namaha. Om Sudhismrutipurananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavad Padam Shankaram Lokashankaram. We are coming to the end of the Bhashyam, the Shankaracharya's commentary on the 20th verse of the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. The Bhashyakara says, Asmin mantre Shadbhava vikaraha laukika vastu vikriya atmani pradishidhyante sarva prakara vikriya rehita atma iti vakyartha yasmat evam tasmat ubhau tau na vijanitaha iti purvena mantrena asya sambandha. So Bhashyakara says, in this mantra, the 6 kinds of transformations or modifications or changes are denied in Atman. The Atman is beyond Sarvikaras, Jayade, Asti, Varthade, Viparinamade, Apakshiyade, Vinashyade. These are the 6 changes according to the Nairittika school, the Nirukta school, which are referred to here. Atman doesn't come into existence, so Atman doesn't cease to exist. And Atman doesn't have a state of existing because it is always existing and it never undergoes changes or modifications like growth, evolution, decay and disappearance or death. So all these 6 changes or vikaras or modifications are denied in Atman. Atman is beyond all these changes. It is the changeless, eternal, immortal reality. The world and all these things that we see in the world are subject to these changes. And Atman is beyond all this. And then another implication is Sarva Prakara Vikriya Rehita Atma iti Vakyartha. Therefore, this passage essentially means that this Atman is devoid of any of these changes. Yasmat evam tasmat ubhau tau na vijanita iti purvena mantrena asya sambandha. So, those who believe that this Atman is subject to any of these changes do not know the true changeless nature of the Atman. So those who believe that Atman can be a doer, Atman can be associated with any kind of activities like killing or any kind of an object of activities as being killed, all these do not apply to Atman. Those who have these wrong notions, ubhau tau na vijanita, they do not know the true nature of Atman. That should be understood in this particular context. So we have to remember here the concept of God in Vedanta is not an anthropomorphic creator God, rather a reality that exists in all of us. Vedanta or Advaita doesn't deny other concepts of God. Vedanta says, as we evolve more and more in spiritual life, when we do not feel the need of these worldly empirical things for our existence, then our concept of God also goes beyond the concept of God as a creator of the world, and we realize the Atman exists in everything, or God exists in everything as one divine eternal spark. This is the point to be understood. Shankaracharya says elsewhere, of course this is very important to remember, this Atman doesn't come into existence and it doesn't cease to exist. Atman cannot be created like a pot maker creates a pot. Atman is not utpadya in the language of Vedanta, and Atman cannot be created through any kind of refining process. Atman is not samskarya, and again Atman cannot be created by changing certain things like vikarya, for example, the milk becoming curd or yogurt through a process of vikara or change. So Atman doesn't come into existence in any of these ways, and Atman is, or Atmajnanam, or the realization of the true nature of Atman is not the attainment of a new knowledge, rather it is a self-discovery. It is a kind of inner spiritual journey towards our own true nature. Somehow we forget our nature and then we come back to our true knowledge, the true knowledge of our nature. So in other words, the realization of Atman is a self-discovery. It is not an attainment. It is not apya, it is not vikarya, samskarya or utpadya. So all these are denied in Atman, all these processes which are relevant only in the context of empirical things. So mokshasya akaryatvad, Shankaracharya says in another context, this moksha, liberation, it is not caused by any result, it is not an effect of anything, rather it is a self-discovery, the attainment of our own true nature. Ya enam veti hantaram iti anena mantrena hanana kriyaya karta karmacha bhavati iti pradignyaya na jayate iti anena avikriyatve hedum muktva pradignyadatham upasamkharati. So Bhashya is coming to an end on the 20th verse. After establishing this principle and affirming by this mantra that those who believe that Atman is an actor or Atman is involved in enjoying the results of any activity, they do not know the true nature of Atman. Ya enam viti hantaram, that the self is neither the agent of action nor the object of the any kind of action. That's the idea behind. Now we are coming to the 21st verse of the second chapter. The 21st verse is this: Veda vinashinam nityam ya enam ajam abhyayam kadam sa purusha partha kam ghatayati hantikam. See, famous verse. After establishing that Atman is Shadbhava Rehita, Jnana Maranadi Vikara Rehita, and Atman is not Karta or Bhokta, Kartrutvam and Bhoktrutvam are all both denied in Atman. Then the Bhashyakara says, what exactly is the true nature of Atman? The discussion continues. Katham sa purusha partha kam ghatayati hantikam. So Arjuna was all along interpreting Atman as his body, or rather he was interpreting his body as the Atman. So Dehatma Buddhi. That was the cause of Arjuna's misunderstanding. That's why he was trying to run away from his duties and responsibilities. So Lord Krishna says, how can anyone who realizes that our true nature is Atman, or the soul, which is eternal, which is immortal, which is deathless and birthless, which is imperishable and eternal, and is free from all these changes, how can such a person hurt anyone, and how can such a person feel that he or she could be hurt by anyone else? So that is the discussion now. So the Bhashya begins here. Veda vijanati avinashinam antyabhava vikara rahidam nityam viparinama rahidam yo veda idi sambandha yenam purvena mantrena uttarakshanam ajam janmarahidam avyayam apakshayarahidam katham kena prakarena savidwan purushaha adhikruto hanti hananakriyam karoti katham va ghatayati hantaram prayojayati na kathanjit kanchit hanti na kathanchit kanchit ghātayeti iti ubhayatra akshepa eva arthaha prasnartha asambhavat heturthasya abhikriyattvasya tulyatvat vidushaha sarva karma pradishedha eva prakaranarthaha abhipredo bhavatah hante tu akshepa udaharanarthatvena. This is the Bhashya. Now we will begin the discussion. So Bhashyakara explains here. Veda vijanati avinashinam andibhava vikara rahitam. So by these attributes mentioned in the previous mantra, one will realize the fact that his true nature is Atman, which is Andibhava Rahita, which means he is deathless. It is beyond any of the changes. So when one change, one modification is denied, indirectly it is also a denial of all other 5 modifications. So anything which is deathless cannot naturally be born, because anything which is eternal should be existing all the time. So in the ultimate sense, in the Paramarthika context, anything which is deathless should also be birthless, because it always exists. So there is no question of it coming into existence, which is what we mean by the word birth in the empirical sense. So in that sense, it is always existing without any change. So this Atman is indestructible, is mentioned. Veda vijanati avinashinam. So those who know, those realized, spiritually enlightened people who know that the nature of the self, Atman, is indestructible, that is avinashi. That is, as you mentioned, Antyabhava Vikara Rahitam, that is devoid of the last modification, that is death. And again, Nityam, which is eternal, beyond all changes, which has no change, which is again, it is Ajam, which is unborn, birthless, and also which is inexhaustive. It cannot undergo any change in the form of decay. How can such an enlightened person who is spiritually fit for the highest realization, how can such a person perform any kind of activity like hurting or injuring or killing some person? And how can such a person imagine that he, the Atman, the eternal self, can ever be hurt, can ever be killed? So he realizes himself to be the eternal, immortal, changeless reality. So anyone who realizes his indestructible, imperishable nature, that he is the Atman, he is the eternal self, he realizes that he is beyond all changes, and also there is no question of any kind of activity in him, because the Atman doesn't engage in any kind of activity. The Indriyas and mind alone are involved in any kind of activity. Na kathanchit kanchit hanti, na kathanchit kanchit ghātayeti iti ubhayatra akshepa eva arthaha prasnartha asambhava. A very important point is made here in this particular Bhashya. Such a person will realize that he cannot be slain and he cannot be associated with any activity like doing harm to somebody or doing hurting some person or killing some person. So in these cases, these two words are used. The verse uses kam ghātayati, kam hanti. So these two expressions are to be understood in the proper context and the proper sense. Katham sa purusha partha kam ghātayati hantikam. How can such a person who realizes That is the Atman which is indestructible and imperishable. How can such a person slay anyone, or how can be the cause of the act of slaying, killing or doing harm to somebody? So it is not a question here, rather it is a denial. So kam ghadayati hantikam. So this kam can be interpreted wrongly, of course, as a kind of question. Here it is not question that is implied, rather it is the total denial of any kind of possibility of killing or being killed is implied here. Ubhayatra akshepa eva arthaka. So in both these cases, it is the total denial of any kind of even a distant remote possibility of being subject to any kind of harm or subject to act of killing or engaging in any kind of such killing activity. These are totally denied. So the word kamghadeti, kamkhanti should be understood that as not prasnartha but akshepartha, means it is not in the form of a question, rather it is to assert the total impossibility of any of these things. So the word kam is used in the sense of total denial. So that should be understood. So a very important point is made here. Heturthasya avikriyattasya tulyatvat vidushaka sarva karma pradishedha eva pragarnarthaka abhiprayedo bhagavataka. So this avikriyatva means immutability of Atman should be understood as equally relevant in the context of any kind of activity. So one important principle of Advaita is the Atman, the divine reality present in us as the Antaryami, and the same divine reality which is omnipresent or pervading with the essence of everything. That divine reality is not directly involved in any kind of activity. All activities take place at the level of the senses. Mind is involved. So when the Atman reflects in the form of Sankalpa, Vikalpa, Atmika, Antakarana Vritti in mind, and when mind is attached to the Indriyas, and then Indriyas get involved in different activities, they engage, they get connected to different Indriyarthas or sense objects. So all actions take place at the level of Indriyas. Indriyani Indriyartheshu vartante iti dharayan. In the Gita elsewhere it is stated, the highest devotee, the highest spiritual seeker doesn't identify himself with various activities going on at the level of the senses. Rather, he realizes that senses alone are involved in all these activities. He, the true nature, the self, the Atman, is totally uninvolved. It is the eternal witness, the eternal subject, is a non-participant in all these activities. So, Sarva karma pradishedha eva pragarnarthaka. So, the teaching of the Lord is actually the denial of all actions in the case of a knower of Brahman, in the case of a jnani. That is important. It's important here. Hantehi tu akshepa udaharanarthatvena. So the denial of the act of slaying is only as an example. In the particular story on which the mythological part of the great philosophical poem of Bhagavad Gita is built, it is important. Arjuna was a soldier whose duty was to protect the women folk, the poor people, the weak people, the unprotected people from the evil designs of wicked evildoers. Duryodhana, all these and his crew, they were engaged in doing so much of harm to the common people. So Arjuna, as a soldier, his duty was to protect these people from the evil designs of these monstrous evildoers like Duryodhana, Dushasana and so on. So that's a mythological, the story part of the Bhagavad Gita. So the example of denial of the possibility of killing or being killed in this particular context should be taken only as an example. What the verse implies is this, that Atman is not directly involved in any kind of activity. Here of course the Purvapakshin, the objector, raises some objections. Vidushaha kam karma sambhave hetu vishesham pasyan karmani akshipati bhagavan katham sa purusha iti. So this the Purvapakshin wants an explanation for an important point. He is asking this question. So his problem is this: Vidushaha kam karma sambhave hetu vishesham pasyan karmani akshipati. So yes, katham sa purusha. So you have to remember these two verses from the verse. Kam ghatayati, katham kam ghatayati, katham kam hanti. So the point is, what exactly is the reason? Seeing what particular reason or logical explanation related to the impossibility of action on the part of the Brahmajnani, as the Lord denied karma. So what is the nature, what is the special nature of a Brahmajnani that is implied in denying the possibility of any action? Because the Bhashyakara said earlier that a novel Brahman doesn't consider himself to be involved in any activity. So what is the special reason for explaining why Lord Krishna denies the possibility of any action for a novel Brahman? So what is the special cause for this? So the answer is given: Nanu ukta eva atmanaha abhikriyatvam sarva karma asambhava karana visheshaha. This is the answer. So the answer is this: abhikriyatvam, that is total immutability of Atman, as already being given earlier as sufficient reason for the action, for the absence of all action. We will slowly take up some of the important principles in Mimamsa system and in the course of discussion. So what exactly is the philosophical justification for Sarva Karma Nishedha? On what basis are you arguing that a knower of Brahman, that is somebody who has realized his true nature is Atman, which is Abhikriya, that person is above all action? See, for example, if you have realized Atman, why should you deny the possibility of any action on the part of such a Brahmajnani karma? So we have to remember the particular historical context in which the word karma is used in the Bhashya context. We'll explain that. So the word karma always implies certain Vedic rituals, because that was the sense in which the word karma was being used by the Mimamsakas in the 6th and 7th centuries and 8th centuries when Shankaracharya wrote this. So when we are told that an Atmajnani doesn't engage in any kind of karma, what the Bhashyakara means is that Atmajnani, a knower of the highest self, doesn't perform any of the external Vedic rituals prescribed in the Vedic textbooks, which are meant for those who want to achieve worldly prosperity, who want to achieve worldly wisdom or worldly achievements. So the ultimate purpose of all these Vaidika karmas was either empirical material prosperity in this world and going to heaven, Sarga Prapti, after death. Sarga also had a definite meaning in the Mimamsa context. It is not the heaven as understood in the Abrahamic tradition. Rather, the concept of heaven, according to Mimamsa system, was just an extension of all material wealth and sensual enjoyments that we conceive of in this world. So the Mimamsakas used to argue that the sole purpose of Vedic learning, Vedic culture, was to learn how to perform Vedic rituals and how by performing these rituals one can attain Swarga Prapti, heavenly comforts or comforts in this world. So Purvapaksha is making a statement here. Of course, before Purvapaksha comes, Bhashyakara had already established one point. Nanu ukta eva atmanaga avikriyatvam sarva karma asambhava karana visheshaha. So the avikriyatva or immutability, the unchangeable nature of Atman, has already been cited, was already referred to as sufficient reason for the absence of all karma for a person who has realized that his true nature is Atman. This is the answer given. But this answer needs little more elaboration. It comes in the later. Here, Purvapakshi is raising another question. Satyam mukto nadusa karana visheshaka. But that is not a reason. That doesn't constitute an appropriate reason for the absence of any activity for a Brahmajnani. Brahman may be avikriya. Brahman or Atman may be beyond all activities. But why should a person who realizes that his nature is Brahman also be above all duties and responsibilities? See, you may see a lamppost which is avikriya, which is inactive. Seeing a lamppost doesn't necessarily make you also inactive. So that's how the Purvapakshi interprets. So the explanation is given. Satyam ukto nadu karana visheshaka anyatvad vidushaka avikriyatvad atmana iti. Because there is a difference between a person who knows Brahman, a knower of Brahman called Vidwan, and the Atman which he realizes. There is a difference. So the Purvapakshi doesn't understand, he fails to understand that one of the central principles of Vedanta is Atmavid Atmaiva Bhavati, Brahmavid Brahmaiva Bhavati. A Brahmajnani realizes that the Brahman, the absolute reality that he was trying to realize, is his own true nature. A Brahmajnani realizes his non-difference, his non-distinction from Brahman. So that point is being missed. At that point, it is perhaps not properly understood by the Purvapakshi. So Purvapakshi asks the question, you may realize that you are Brahman, and Brahman may be avikriya. There may be sarva karma asambhava, and there is you may deny all activities in Brahman, kartrutva, bhoktutva, all are denied in Brahman. But why should you who realize Brahman be also avikriya? That's the kind of rather, it's a bit ridiculous question from a philosophical point of view. Nahi avikriyam sthanam vididavataha karmana sambhavati iti chet. You can't say that a person who knows a pillar to be static, pillar cannot move, pillar cannot do any, cannot be engaged in any activity. So because you realize, you see a pillar which is inactive, which is static, you don't become inactive and static just because you see a pillar. But that kind of seeing a pillar and the knowledge of the static nature of a pillar is totally different from the realization of the fact that our true nature is Atman. That point is not well understood by this Purvapakshi. In this context, we have to keep in mind a few important points about Vedanta. I mentioned already earlier that Vedanta makes a very clear, a bold statement, that is, that spiritual liberation is not a result of any kind of activity. There is no karya karana sambandha in realization. At the beginning of our spiritual life, we may perform all the duties and responsibilities as an offering to God. Is Pramana. That's how we begin our spiritual evolution. And slowly we become established in this karma yoga, niskama karma. Pashyan, sunnan, sprisan, jigran, unmishan, nimishan, navi, indriyani, indriyartheshu vartanda, didharayan, etc. Brahmanyathaya karmani sarva, sangam tyaktva karotiha. So these are all many of the ideas mentioned in the Gita. Whatever we do, everything is Brahmanyathaya karmani. All activities are offered to Brahman. This is how we evolve slowly and we become fit for the highest spiritual realization. Karmanishthayaha chitta suddhidvarana purushadha hedutna swadhantrena. So karmanistha can take us to the level of chitta shuddhi or purification of mind or spiritual fitness for Jnana Prapti, and Jnana Prapti naturally leads us to moksha or liberation. This is a scheme. So one may argue it is the niskama karma or activity that we perform to attain chitta shuddhi which actually takes us to liberation. So there is, people may argue wrongly of course, that there is a cause-effect relationship, cause-effect link between our activities, our spiritual sadhanas and spiritual liberation. Without niskama karma, we cannot attain chitta shuddhi, and without chitta shuddhi, there cannot be jnana prapti, and without jnana prapti, there cannot be moksha. That is true. But Advaita says, niskama karma can lead us to chitta shuddhi, but still it is wrong to say that activities on our part, even niskama karma, create liberation. The way a pot maker could create a pot from clay through his ingenuity. A pot maker makes use of the clay, so is the efficient cause, clay is the material cause, and he may make use of auxiliary causes like different machines or different instruments. So all these may be involved in the process of making a clay pot. So like that, through karma, we create liberation. Like a pot maker making pot from clay. The Vedanta says it is not so. So moksha is not utpadya. Moksha is not created by any kind of activity or from any material cause like clay. Moksha is itself. It is not caused by anything. It is the uncaused reality. Because when we lose something and when we get it back, we don't really consider that we have got something new. So liberation or moksha or spiritual realization is only a self-discovery. We are coming back to our own home, which we by mistake thought we are away from. By mistake, we imagine we are away from our own home, and then finally when we realize that it is the place, the real home, we are not getting something new. So spiritual liberation, Brahmajnanam, is only self-discovery. It is a result of our inner journey. So that's an important point to remember. The second important point is Brahmajnanam or liberation, moksha is not apyam. That is grama gramantaram. You go from one village to another village. You are leaving one village behind and reaching another village. So you are leaving a state of bondage behind and reaching a state of being liberated, a state of liberation. It is not like that. We are not leaving anything behind. Rather, we are self-discovering our true nature, which we somehow forgot. So, Atmajnanam or liberation or moksha is not Utpadya, it is not Apya. Again, it is not Samskarya. When we want oil, we refine oil seeds, or we may process or refine the crude, the raw material from which we may process oil. So from oil seeds, through a process of refining or processing, we get oil. It is a kind of samskarya, means it is the result of processing or refining. Atmajnanam or moksha or liberation is not the result of any kind of processing or refining. It is not samskarya. And moksha or Atmajnanam is not vikarya. So if you want curds or yogurt, you have to make use of milk. So for milk, through parinama, through some kind of changes, you get curds or yogurt. So it is vikarya. Change from one state to another state. Atman or moksha or liberation is not the result of any kind of vikara. So this is a very important point, remember. Moksha in Vedanta is not the result of any kind of activity. Mokshasya akaryatva, the Bhashyakara says. And again, in very many bhashyas, different contexts, Bhashyakara either directly states or implies that moksha or Atmajnanam is not Utpadya, it is not Apya, it is not Samskarya, it is not Vikarya. Because all these involve some kind of kriya, activity. If moksha or spiritual liberation is a result of any kind of activity, then it can never be permanent. It could get dissolved, it could disappear, it could be affected in course of time. Anything which is caused by something cannot be eternal. So moksha is not caused by something. Moksha actually means we are discovering our own true nature. So that's an important point, remember. So now the Purvapakshi comes forward asking some important questions. He says, Satyam ukto nadu sa karana visheshaka anditva vidushaka vikriyatva atmanaka. Sorry, it is a wrong spelling here. Anyatva vidushaka avikriyatva atmanidi. So there is an anyatvam, there is a distinction, there is a difference between vidwan and atman. So Brahmavid Brahmaiva Bhavati, a Brahmajnani realizes that he is Brahman itself, is non-distinct, non-different from Brahman itself. That particular important point of Vedanta is not understood by this Purvapakshi, by this objector. That's why he is asking this question. Nahi avikriyam sthanam viditavataha karmana sambhavati iti ched. Suppose we put forward this argument. A person who sees a pillar to be static or inactive, he doesn't himself become static or inactive just because he sees a pillar. Now, the Purvapakshi has finished his argument. Satyam ukto nadu sakarana visheshaka anyatva vidushuka avikriyatva atmanaka iti nahi avikriyam sthanam viditavataha karmana sambhavati iti ched. This is a Purvapaksha. Now the Siddhantin, the Advaitin begins his answer. Na vidushaka atmatva na dekadis sanghadasya vidvatta. So that's an important point. Now the point is, na vidushaka atmatva na dekadi sanghadasya vidvatta. Because it is not so. First the Bhashyakara says, no, it is not so. Because there is a reason for it. The enlightened person, the Atmajnani, the Vidwan, and the Atman are the same, they are identical. There is no distinction between Atmajnani and Atman, because what Atmajnani realizes is that he is no more just a body-mind complex. He wrongly interpreted himself to be just a psychophysical mechanism, a body-mind complex, where he realizes that he is actually the self, it has his own nature. So this realization is not like seeing a pillar in front of you. This realization takes place in the form of an inner spiritual experience, which actually cannot be explained or described. What an Atmajnani realizes is that till now I thought I am this body, I am this mind, I am the intellect, and so on. When he reaches his spiritual destination, immediately he realizes that the Atman that he was searching for is actually he himself. That Atman is not different from he himself. Ataha parisheshya asamkhada atma vidwan avikriya iti tasya vidushakam karma asambhavad akshepo yuktaha kadam sa purusha partha. So in the earlier Bhashya, Bhashyakara said kadam sa purusha partha, this should be taken in akshepartha, not in prasnartha. It should be implied that it is not possible even to conceive of an Atmajnani being engaged in any kind of activity like doing harm to somebody, killing, or with the object of any activity like undergoing or experiencing the results of any action. So it should be taken in akshepartha and it should not be taken in prasnartha. It cannot be interpreted as a question, rather it should be interpreted as a denial of any possibility of action. Now, once we eliminate all other possible interpretations, because once we realize the fact that dehadi sanghadasya na vidvatta, knowledge and realization is logical only in the context of Atman, not in the context of Dehadi Sankhara, this body-mind complex. Because there is no enlightenment so far as we interpret, so long as we interpret ourselves to be the sum total of this body, mind, intellect, and so on. So once we eliminate the possibility of this body-mind complex as attaining enlightenment or spiritual realization, once we eliminate that possibility, that's called parishesha nyaya. Once we completely eliminate even a distant possibility of this body-mind complex realizing that its true nature is Atman, after eliminating this possibility, what is left out? Then we realize that this Atman alone is actually Vidwan. So then it follows that this Vidwan, this enlightened one, who is identical with Atman, is actually not different from Atman. It has got all the attributes of Atman. So the avikriyatva, sarvantaryamitva, sarvavyapitva, all these characteristics, the immanence, the omnipresence, the transcendence, and the total freedom from being subject to any kind of activity. All these are natural characteristics of Atman, though it is wrong to say that Atman can be interpreted as being endowed with these characteristics. Still this is the only way we can explain or describe the indescribable Atman. So one should understand. Even the attributes like avikriyatva, etc., that we use in the context of Atman, we use only as an attempt to explain something which is really beyond explanation. So all the so-called definitions or explanations are only attempts to understand at the intellectual level from a state of intellectual perspective to explain what actually is a matter of experience or inner experience, because The Atma Jnana is not a matter of intellectual perception, it is a matter of inner experience. So that we will realize, we will explain that later. Of course, here is an important word here, Ata Parisheshyat Asamkhadatma. So, is a very important maxim in Vedanta, Parishesha Nyaya. Parisheshyat Antajadeva Yat Siddha. That is the law of elimination. If you eliminate all other possibilities, then what is left out is to be accepted as the only possible explanation, as the only logical explanation. If you eliminate all the other possible explanations, then what is left out is to be accepted as the only logically acceptable explanation. So it's already stated, since Dehadi Sankhada, the body-mind complex as such cannot have the spiritual enlightenment, then what do we have? If we eliminate from our system, our personality, the senses, the mind, the intellect, and all other faculties, if you just exclude all these, then what is left out? What is that which gives light, which gives life, consciousness? This is body-mind complex. It should be something other than body-mind complex. And what is that other which alone is left out? Parisishta, and that is Atman. So Atman alone can have Advaita. So that's we understood in this context. Therefore, Akshepa is Yukta. Yatha buddhyadi akridasya shabdadi arthasya avikriya eva san buddhivritya viveka vijnanena vidya upalabdha atma kalpyate. So this is also very important explanation here. So some of the commentators say. Now, one important point is this. This Atman, it cannot. It is sometimes we of course already stated here that Atman is the knower. Atman is the perceiver. Atman is the subject, the cognizer, and so on. Vedanta tells us that even this is only a partial explanation. Atman cannot even be defined as a perceiver, as a pramata, because the highest realization of Atman takes place when we transcend the state of Tribudi, Dhyana, Dhyeya and Dhyata, Pramata, Prameya and Pramana. So even to explain Atman as being endowed with Vidya, knowledge, even to explain Atman as Pramata is not the highest explanation of Atman. Because even Aham Brahmasmi Mahavakya itself belongs to the penultimate state. So towards the end of this Chatusutri Bhashya, Shankaracharya makes some very important point here. So Bhashyakara says, Annishtabhya Atma Vijnana Pa Pramadruttam Atmanaha Annishtasya Pramataiva Papma Doshadi Varjitaha Dekhatma Pratyayo Yadut Pramanatvena Kalpitaha Laukikam Taddevedam Pramanam Tva Atmanischayat. So it comes at the end of the Chatusutri Bhashya. So we can consider ourselves to be Pramata, the seeker, the investigator, or the one who is going in search of the highest truth, and so on. But this state disappears when we actually experience that we are the Atman. So even Aham Brahmasmi, that Mahavakya, takes us only the penultimate state. At the highest experience level, when Aham Brahmasmi becomes a matter of inner experience, we even transcend that Mahavakya itself. So even an Anubhuti Vakya is below the real Anubhuti. Anubhuti cannot be brought down to the level of a Vakya. So that's why Bhashyakara says here, Dekhatma Pratyayo Yadut Pramanatvena Kalpitaha. who is a pramada? What is pramana? Even when we try to do spiritual sadhanas, even when we try to make use of all pramanas, proper epistemological tools, to understand the true meaning of the Shastras, and we explain and we engage in discussion on the true meaning of the spiritual statements, that state of intellectual conviction it belongs to a penultimate state. So pramana, pramada, prameya distinction vanishes when we realize the true nature of our self. So even aham brahmasmi, which is the highest statement which explains inner experience, the statement itself is one step below the experience dimension of that statement. So Mahavakya, Anubhuti Mahavakya itself is one step below the Anubhuti itself. So that's an important point, remember. So Bhashyam says here, Yatha buddhyadi akridasya shabdarthasya avikriya eva san buddhivritya avivega vijnanena avidya upalabdha atma kalpide. So the point is, this since this karma is unthinkable at any state, when the atma is related to the buddhi, and then we try to understand this, then at that state we may perhaps try to explain that this is knowledge, this is perception and so on. But that itself belongs to the penultimate state. Through avidya, this Atman is deemed to be a knower of both sense objects and the Atman itself. That's an important point, remember. The same Atman, when reflecting in buddhi, and this becomes buddhi vritti, enables us to pursue external empirical objects. At that very level, acting as a vidya, as true knowledge, when this Atman reflects in purified intellect, when buddhi or mind becomes sattvic buddhi, when we attain chitta suddhi, then the Atman reflects in the pure mind or pure intellect in his full effulgence. At that time, we are able to realize this Atman. But that state itself belongs to avidya level. Because even Atman manifesting through pure intellect itself is different from Atman. Atman manifesting as sattvic buddhi can give us an intellectual, a proper idea of what Atman is. But that Atma Anubhuti itself comes later. So any kind of intellectual cognition, even when guided by Shastras and guided by proper purified intellect, falls below the experience dimension of that intellectual perception. So the point is, even Shastra Jnanam, intellectual discussion or spiritual topics belong to avidya level, belong to a lower level. When we transcend that state, then going beyond the intellectual cognition of the reality, when we reach the experience level, then only we realize our non-distinction and non-different from the self, the Atman. At that point, there is no pramana, there is no pramada, and there is no prameya. That experience is beyond description, beyond words, beyond explanation. That's why Sri Ramakrishna says the gospel at the highest level of spiritual experience, samadhi, the language is silence. Even we have to transcend the level of Mahavakyas to reach the experience dimension of the Mahavakya. So the language of experience is silence. Antaya Bahuvadinam Anantaya Mokam. The infinite experience can only be expressed in one language, and that one language is silence, spiritual experience. Below that level, we have got Gayatri mantras, Omkaras, then Gayatri mantras, then Vedas, and so on. So all the Vedas, Upanishads all will take us in that direction. And beyond Vedas, we have got Gayatri Mantra. And beyond Gayatri, we have got the Omkara, Pranava, which is the essence of Gayatri. And even beyond Pranava or Omkara, we have the experience. And even Omkara, Pranava is several steps below the experience level. So, the highest experience is beyond both Vidya and also Avidya. Because the reflection of Atman in Buddhi, one way, in one direction, it helps us to understand external objects. When that Buddhi becomes pure and refined, then we are able to understand the higher spiritual philosophy, spiritual truths. But intellectual understanding of those spiritual truths falls short of the inner experience of those truths. So the highest Buddhi, the highest intellectual perception can only take us to the penultimate state, with the real experience is both Vidya and also Avidya. It is beyond explanation, beyond description, it is pure experience. So we will continue the discussion in the next session. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Pranamastu.